There are a lot of technologies that peak within a blip of time. And if not for what came next, who knows what would have happened? Like 8 track. Many of you listening know what I'm talking about when I say 8-track tape, but many of you probably don't because they existed for such a short period of time. 8-track tapes were these large, paperback sized plastic tapes for music. Car companies began installing these players in the late 1960s, but it was mostly the 70s when 8 tracks were popular. But then the cassette tape burst onto the scene. Cassettes and cassette players were smaller and therefore more portable. Plus, you could forward and rewind, a pretty helpful feature. So the makers of 8 track tapes found themselves at the top of the game, and then, just like that, they had no product at all. You see this happening again and again throughout history. But here's the thing about radio and radios. Technology after technology entered the scene, offering improvements to the radio, offering features like video that radio could not offer. And yet, radio did not go away. And it's kind of hard to believe that even today, after television, after cassettes and CDs, MP3 players, and streaming, we still have radio. We still have radio stations. We still have millions of people who welcome the radio every day. But when we go back to the beginning, to the 1920s, radio was not welcomed by most Major League Baseball teams. Radio was the enemy because it was new, it was unknown. Tonight, the story of how radio overcame the persistent, powerful factor of human fear and unwillingness to change, and how radio's slow roll led to a golden age that saw radio dominate the airwaves decades after television entered the scene, and fear turned into trust and loyalty and love. From historic milestones
That's it! Holy cow! A strikeout gets his 300th career win, and I tell you, this is...
to euphoric moments shared by millions,
In a year that has been so improbable, the impossible has happened.
to the simple banter that brought us together,
But yeah, it's foul. Malachi with the call. I love that name.
It's a good name.
When you and I have a child together, we should name him Malachi.
Welcome to the Midnight Library of Baseball, Season 4, the broadcast that raised us, from radio to television and beyond. I'm Ben Orlando. As human beings, we fear what we don't know, and we put up walls to avoid getting hurt in every sense. Because there's deception out there, because we all have been hurt before. We're skeptical, we're cynical. It's really hard to be open minded and trust. This is worse today than it was in the 1920s, but this is the fight when it comes to invention and innovation. Think about all the opportunities and connections we lose because we're so guarded, we're so unwilling to take risks. You hear this all the time from people who find a new hobby or relationship. They say, God, why did I wait so long to try this? And no doubt, baseball owners were asking these same questions in the 1940s. But the reality was, baseball team owners were deathly afraid of the radio. And this was for one simple reason. In the 1920s, owners made their money one way and one way only: ticket sales. And they thought, if people can simply listen to the game on the radio, why would they come to the ballpark? Mike Halpert, who teaches sports economics at the University of Washington, and who we heard from in episode 2, explains why owners were so reluctant. Here's Halpert.
In economics, we call this a path dependency problem. So you start down a path and you've got a certain way of doing things and you're moving along. When something novel comes along like radio, it's going to take a major shift. And it can be a big gamble because if I do this major shift and I'm wrong, I may not recover, or it might take me 10 years to recover. So the analogy I always use is the 1970s when the American automobile manufacturers were making these great, big, heavy, big sedans and big cars. And then the gasoline crisis came along and gasoline exploded to 50 cents a gallon, this unheard of price. And you had all of a sudden all these Japanese cars were coming along and they were making a big dent in the market, selling these small fuel efficient cars. And at the time, the American manufacturers ignored it. They would have had to retool their entire assembly line. So it would have taken a major shift. And they said, we're just going to keep doing things the way we did because we don't believe that this will be the future. And of course, they were wrong.
But the thing about radio in the 1920s, when it came to baseball, was that there wasn't a lot of retooling that needed to be done. You didn't have to rebuild an entire infrastructure. You simply let a few broadcasters set up shop in your stadium. You allow the telegraph guy to send updates to stations, and there you go. But to jump back into the brains of the owners for a minute, it kind of makes sense, because they had no idea what this thing was. They couldn't wrap their brains around the potential of this new talking box. Well, this isn't exactly true, because early on, one MLB owner saw with crystal clarity the possibilities of radio. Cubs owner William K. Wrigley Jr., chewing gum magnate. Wrigley started airing Cubs games as early as 1925. From historian James Walker, quote, Wrigley immediately recognized the value of the felicitous spring to fall marriage of youthful radio and the baseball establishment. End quote. Walker continued, quote, the radio game offered owners a 2-hour daily commercial for their teams. Weekday daylight games could reach women, children, and some men, while weekend contests could add most of the male population to baseball's radio audience. End quote. Now, Wrigley also saw the potential of selling his gum, but he recognized from the start that here with radio was a giant megaphone. And when you're talking about women and children, that's a huge segment of the population left out of the equation. Roberta Newman makes a good point in her book, Here's the Pitch, The Amazing, True, New, and Improved Story of Baseball and Advertising. When she says it wasn't just about turning women into baseball fans, it was about understanding their true roles in the family. From Newman, quote, women were the primary decision makers when it came to household spending, and they also tended to control household entertainment budgets, end quote. Which means it was going to be the wives who planned family outings, and those family outings now might be to the ballpark. Throughout the 19th and early 20th century, baseball was important to millions of people, but to many millions more, it was a world they knew nothing about. And for women, it was a world they heard about from their husbands, their brothers, their sons, their friends, but it was still foreign. So let's take a moment to look at the evolution. We already know that from 1921 to 1923, the number of radios sold escalated quickly. By the late 1920s, you have millions of radios in the home. You have millions of wives doing household chores throughout the day. And now in the background, you have the radio. There's music, and in the beginning, there's limited programming. So some of the background sounds will be baseball games.
1-1 is the count. Throws again, and
Or
Jackie
women
swings,
will
and it's
listen to a
1-4.
show,
Strike
and
two.
then, while they're
That's
busy,
1-2.
because of the nature
One
of
ball and
radio,
two strikes.
one show turns into another. And that next show might be a ball game.
1-2.
And as their daily routines play out,
Waiting up there
baseball
again.
slowly but
Maybe
surely becomes
getting
a
his
part
stride.
of
Takes a
that
look at first
routine.
base. Starts his wind up.
Women learn about
First
players.
2 runs of the
They
ball
get used
game.
to
Both on earned
broadcasters
runs.
and the
From the
lull of the game,
if it hadn't been made, would have made it. The third out when Ventura flied out.
with pockets of
And runners
suspense
around
and
second
drama
third.
and action.
And pitches, and Jackie hits the ball out in the left center. I think it's going to fall in. There it is. For a base hit. One run is in. The ball is coming into the plate as the second runner scores. And the other runner
And
advances
really,
to second and
not
third.
many women went to games.
Hayes coming in pretty
Before the
high.
1920s,
And
it was
already
around
rolling over
10
his
to
back, almost
20%.
on his feet. It's a
So, for
single.
many women working in the home, the radio would have exposed them to the first roaring crowds, the first sounds of mass celebration, the first sounds of cheering, excited, jubilant fans. And in addition to women, you also have children who come home from school in time to catch a few innings of their favorite team. Radio is a slow tidal wave that sweeps baseball into the homes and lives of millions. And the statistics prove Wrigley's foresight. In 1928, the Chicago Cubs set a National League record for attendance, and Wrigley sold a heck of a lot of chewing gum. Here's another telling statistic. Between 1925 and 1931, Major League ball clubs that didn't broadcast their games on radio had an attendance increase of 27%, while the Cubs, who embraced radio from the start, in that same time span, saw a jump in attendance of 117%. But the owners of other clubs could not see the value of radio. They couldn't see that from a numbers standpoint, if you add millions of fans within a radius of several hours from, say, Chicago or New York, that translates into thousands upon thousands of fans taking buses into the city at least a few times a year for a ball game. And some of those rural fans will eventually move to the city and attend even more games. If just a fraction of those fans brought in by radio made it to the ballpark, it's a windfall for owners. But guess what? The owners didn't see any of this, even with the statistics. The fear of change and the unknown ran so deep that MLB clubs could not process the many advantages of broadcasting their games on the radio, especially home games. They couldn't foresee the scope of radio, even as the Cubs were reaping the benefits. Fear is louder than logic, and soon fear turned into policy. In 1926, 5 years after that very first baseball broadcast, the American League officially banned radio from broadcasting their home games. That's right. They were so scared of attendance dropping that they wouldn't allow stations to broadcast their home games. Except there was such a loud outcry about the World Series that they made an exception. Now, I don't have stats for 1926, but 1927, around 20 million people tuned into that first World Series game. And overall, it's likely that more than 20% of the entire US population listened to some part of the series. And newspapers felt the same fear as team owners. Donna Halper wrote an article titled, How the Radio Impacted the Team and Fans. And she points out that for a while, many newspapers ignored the radio. They pretended it didn't exist because they thought people would turn to radio and stop reading the paper. But it was the opposite, especially when it came to baseball. People listened to the games on the radio and they wanted more stories, more statistics. For many sports columnists, radio was the greatest thing that ever happened to them. Over the next few decades, Major League Baseball continued to be erratic and illogical in its relationship to radio. Between 1934 and 1938, the New York Yankees, Brooklyn Dodgers, and New York Giants signed a 5-year deal to ban radio broadcasts for their home games. And this is years after the proof was already in from the Cubs and a few other clubs that showed radio bringing in fans by the boatloads. The St. Louis Browns allowed radio, but prohibited talking between plays. You know, that thing that everyone wanted. And then the St. Louis Cardinals banned radio in 1934. When they allowed it in 1935, attendance at the ballpark went up 54%. Term for banning home games on the radio is blackout. The games were blacked out. Now, looking at these stories from modern day lenses, you might think, well, they didn't understand this new technology. It makes sense. But when television came decades later, the exact same thing happened for decades. Again, here's Mike Halpert.
I think the most interesting thing is how when television came along, Major League Baseball completely forgot what radio did for baseball, and they went back to exactly the same arguments. Oh no, we can't televise our games or nobody will come. And it's like, are you serious? Some of the people are still in the game who, objected to radio, realized how profitable it was, not only because I could sell the game on radio, but because I'm being paid to advertise. This is the best way, right? WGN comes to me and says, I'll give you $1 million if you let me advertise your product all year long. Isn't that a great deal? And yet, when television came along, the exact same arguments and the exact same things happened.
Most major league clubs continued to black out televised home games into the 1970s, which just goes to emphasize the conservative nature of humans. It really takes a lot for people to change their routine. When we go back to the 1920s, despite baseball throwing up all these roadblocks, radio plugs along, and something's about to happen that drastically changes the story. If you'd like to support Midnight Library of Baseball and help it reach more listeners, please donate at midnightlibraryofbaseball.com. You can also leave a review at iTunes or wherever you listen. Thank you. Now, back to the show. Even as radio is exploding, it's not a mobile unit. Radios were very large in size, sometimes as large as jukeboxes. They were meant to be placed somewhere in the home and not moved again. But in the late 1920s, radios in cars became standardized during production. And this is really the time when automobiles start to take off across the country. Can you imagine? Automobiles are taking off, and then you add radios? And this is something we absolutely take for granted today. But imagine all of these things coming together at the time. And cars are now affordable. You go to buy your first car, and the dealer says, "Oh, and how would you like to listen to the Phillies while you're driving to work?" Can you imagine? To someone who had never conceived of this idea, to be suddenly presented with a dream come true? This is an era of exploding technology. A few years earlier, most people are not driving cars. They're not listening to the radio. A few years before that, they didn't know what either were, cars or radios. And now, boom, you're on the road in this machine that can take you from point A to point B in record time. And there's this magical device. You don't know how it works, but it transmits audio play by play of your favorite thing in the world, baseball. It's a new day in America. What team owners didn't realize was that while they were guarding the gates, another future staple was sneaking through the back door. Advertising. Something we're all familiar with if we've listened to the radio for more than 5 minutes are the commercials. I'm still surprised when I hear a commercial on the radio how fake and staged it sounds. Like it's bad. And I roll my eyes because I've seen and heard thousands upon thousands of commercials. I'm desensitized. But no one in the 1920s and 30s was desensitized because they'd never heard advertising. Let me just say that again. They'd never heard advertising. That sounds pretty blissful, right? Not that there wasn't advertising, but your ears were not bombarded by ads. And even when radio became a thing, listeners for years would not hear ads on the radio during baseball games because for years there was none. According to Roberta Newman, baseball broadcasts were positioned as a public service, which tells you how baseball was seen at the time. And because it was seen as a public service, sponsorships didn't come in until the mid 1930s. That's 15 years after the first radio broadcast of a ball game. But no sponsorship didn't mean no advertising. As historian James Walker pointed out, a radio broadcast was a 2 hour commercial for baseball. But this, again, is mind blowing how blind owners were because their bottom line was money. And they had no clue that they could have been making millions of dollars in 1920s money from companies running ads or broadcasters talking about products during the game, or even simply advertising their ball club. Because it wasn't as if baseball had a lot of competition for programming at the time. It's like reality television today. From a radio station's perspective, baseball broadcasts were easy and cheap. You didn't have scripts, you didn't have to pay many people. You just had to sit and report what was already happening. Of course, owners and other baseball people eventually saw the dollar signs flashing in their eyes. Remember Babe Ruth, frozen like a deer in the headlights during his first radio interview? By the 1930s, he'd adjusted to this new technology. And as you might remember from season one, Babe Ruth became the spokesperson for every product under the sun. And this meant radio ads as well. There's a funny story that Roberta Newman describes in her book about Babe Ruth doing a commercial for Wheaties in the 1930s. It was a live commercial, and Ruth was supposed to talk about a recipe for using Wheaties to make cookies. During the practice runs, for some reason, Ruth kept saying cookies instead of cookies. So up comes the live performance, and it gets to Ruth's part, and he says, quote, "And so, boys and girls, don't forget to tell your mother to buy Wheaties so she can make these cookies." End quote. And in the live performance, there's a brief silence, followed by Ruth swearing, live on air, saying, quote, "I'm a son of a bitch if I didn't say cookies again." End quote. But nothing happened. No public outcry. Maybe because at this point, Ruth had lowered the bar, if that sounds familiar to you, living today. This was more than a decade into his relationship with the press and the public. People were probably like, oh, there goes the babe again. I imagine if Lou Gehrig said the same thing, there would have been a different reaction. And speaking of Gehrig, he flubbed his own commercial around the same time. He was doing an ad for a cereal called Huskies, and they asked him, "Hey, Lou, what's your favorite cereal?" And he said, "Wheaties." Oops. So, okay, radio is gaining acceptance, which for owners means more money, and for fans means more accessibility. It's a good thing, right? Well, something happened when radio was finally accepted by major league owners. They, and by they I mean mostly baseball commissioner Kennesaw Mountain Landis, put a gag on broadcasters. This led to radio for years being described through rose colored glasses. Radio was used as a tool to promote the game instead of as a tool to honestly report the game. As Benjamin Rader describes in his book, In Its Own Image, Commissioner Landis worked hard to create a more sanitized version of the game for listeners at home. Landis forbade broadcasters from questioning umpires or managers. And in 1933, during World Series coverage, when the lead broadcaster for CBS, Ted Husing, criticized some of the umpires' calls, Commissioner Landis banned Husing from covering World Series games for life because Husing suggested that an umpire may have gotten a call wrong. And this is not a one off. We'll talk about this later with broadcasters like Red Barber and Harry Carey getting fired because they exposed some uncomfortable truth about the game. But by the late 1930s, the idea of promoting the game through broadcasting was in full effect, and it goes hand in hand with ads and sponsorship. In 1939, baseball announcers were brought into the fold. Famous broadcaster Red Barber and others were made to attend a training conference before the start of the season. Was this training conference run by the Association of American Broadcasters or Major League Baseball? No. This conference was run by General Mills, a cereal company. At the conference, the announcers were trained to keep in mind 3 critical ideas whenever they broadcasted. When they talked and read play-by-play, they needed to always consider how their reading and behavior could 1. Increase attendance at the ballpark, 2. Increase radio listenership, and 3. Increase product sales for whoever was sponsoring them. And these strategies worked incredibly well for the people who wanted them to work. During the 1930s, studies showed that its baseball-related marketing helped Wheaties sell 4,500,000 cases of Wheaties, more than 3 times their sales before they began working with MLB. This year, 1939, when broadcasting and baseball and advertising formed their magical relationship, it's the same year of another famous first, the first televised Major League Baseball game. And here's where we begin to see the gentle protests of diehard radio fans. It's funny how quickly something so new can become so ingrained, so cherished. In the beginning, when it came to television, it was hard to watch a baseball game, and we'll talk about why. But even when reception and clarity and coverage improved, there were many people who preferred to listen to the games on the radio if they couldn't be at the games. In his book, Benjamin Rader tells the story of sports writer Bill Gilbert and his brother lamenting the shift from radio to television. According to Rader, Gilbert and his brother invented, quote, an entirely mythical league populated by ball players who performed only in accordance with the dreams and imaginations of their creators. For Gilbert, the Missouri youths, and millions like them, television intruded upon the imagination. It reduced the magic of baseball. End quote. And this from Gilbert himself. Quote, thereafter, baseball was never again serious. The trouble is that it is very hard to have bigger-than-life imaginary playmates when smaller-than-life but photographically accurate models of the real thing are living room intimates. End quote. I love this quote and this story and the way Gilbert puts it. And I can't say I ever thought of it this way because I only ever watched games on television. But he's right. The players I saw were both real and tiny. It didn't stop me from worshiping them, in a way. But now I wonder, If I'd only heard them on the radio, what my brain and imagination would have done to them. And when we're talking about differences between TV and radio, we're also talking about how fans experience the broadcasters differently, which is paramount to the bonds formed, the connections made between baseball and fans. It was the broadcaster who wove the invisible threads that seeped in and embedded in millions of brains and hearts. The first of the big time, nationally recognized broadcasters of the day, of radio and then television, was Red Barber. Full name Walter Rainier Barber.
Well, let's jimmy along now into the last of the second inning. Ferrello, Hodges, and Cox. Pittler, Jake Pittler. Sugarfooting along there at first base. He's the coach at that point. Milton Stark coaching at third. Mel Queen pitching. And ahead now 2-0.
Starting in 1934, Barber broadcast for the Reds, Dodgers, and Yankees over a 30-year career. When I was reading different books and articles on announcers and on Barber, I came across this article on Sabre by Warren Corbett, who begins the piece with this, quote, Red Barber confessed that when he learned the Dodgers would field a black player, his first reaction was to quit his job, end quote. Now, of course, that black player was Jackie Robinson in 1947. But that's pretty inflammatory, and it gives you an image of Red Barber, as in, he's a racist. And then Corbett includes a quote from Barber, who grew up in Florida. Quote, I saw black men tarred and feathered by the Ku Klux Klan and forced to walk the streets. I had grown up in a completely segregated world, end quote. Now, that still doesn't tell you a lot. It tells you more, but it doesn't tell you what exactly Red Barber is thinking and feeling about race and about Jackie Robinson entering the major leagues. I find this whole story really interesting, but specifically, it's interesting because I didn't uncover it right away. I'd read and heard about Red Barber from various sources, but it took some digging, finding more than a dozen sources to get to this issue of race and Jackie Robinson. And the thing is, in Major League Baseball, before Jackie Robinson, race is just not going to come up in the broadcasts. Because one, you didn't have black players, and two, you had Commissioner Landis keeping the lid on the topic. But for Red Barber, that meant 13 years before this soul searching had to happen. Because ultimately, Barber would not quit when Robinson joined the Dodgers, and Barber would face some difficult internal questions. But in the beginning, Barber stumbled into broadcasting as an absolute fluke. In 1930, Barber was going to college for education and working as a janitor for a radio station, WRUF. There was an agriculture professor scheduled to read his paper on air, but the professor didn't show up. In a bind, the manager saw Barber and asked him to read the paper. In Warren Corbett's account, Barber was promised a free dinner for the task. So he walked into the booth and read this paper titled Certain Aspects of Bovine Obstetrics. Sounds like a real nail-biter. But after this reading, Barber was offered a job at the station, which eventually led to an opportunity broadcasting the first football game of the season for the University of Florida. And for Barber, the opportunity turned into a gargantuan failure. According to Barber, the event was, quote, undoubtedly the worst broadcast ever perpetrated on an innocent and unsuspecting radio audience, end quote. He was so bad that he was yanked off the air. But one thing people would soon learn about Red Barber was that he was extremely studious and persistent. He took a critical look at what he was doing wrong, and he did his best to fix it. He spent the next 2 weeks watching the University of Florida's football practice and talking to the coaches and players. And after convincing the station to give him another chance, Barber never looked back. In 1934, he was hired by the Reds to do play-by-play, In 1935, he called the World Series. And what Barber said he had on his mind then was Ted Husing. Remember, in 1934, Commissioner Landis banned Husing for questioning the umpires. And in 1935, as Barber and others gathered before the first game of the World Series, Commissioner Landis told them, quote, "Don't editorialize, report," end quote. And so Barber did, although not so cut and dry.
He's fidgeting around out there on the mound. There's nobody on base. Pumps once, pumps twice. Right-handed kicks high, throws, fastball, swung on, drilled deep out into right center field. Back goes Thompson, way back in the corner, and makes the catch 390 feet away in the right center field corner. Torstuber tagged it, but it's just out in the two. Two men gone, and Jim Russell.
Journalist Alan Barra, in the online magazine Salon, recounted what it was like to listen to Barber's broadcasts. Quote, "There were no complex statistics, no hype, and of course, no visuals, just poetry. When the wind was blowing the flag, a description of how the fielders were set, an anecdote or two about each player. With nothing to work with but words, Barber painted a picture of the game that kick-started my own imagination in a way that technology never could." End quote. And like many broadcasters to follow, Barber had his own expressions, such as, "The game is just as tight as a brand new pair of shoes on a rainy day," or "They'll tear up the pea patch before the day is over." He was a bit folksy with his expressions, but fellow broadcaster Ernie Harwell said it was a bit of a performance. From Harwell, quote, "The ironic thing was, he was a very cultured man, and on the air he sounded like some guy from the backwoods," end quote. But Barber was from the South, so those sayings could have been as real as his love for the opera. Barber was also the first big-time broadcaster, and a lot of the things he figured out became standards for those who followed him. Just listen to this clip.
At the end of 2 innings, Posterio sending it all to you from Ebbets Field in Brooklyn. It is Pittsburgh 2 runs on the home run with Murtaugh aboard in the second inning. The Dodgers nothing. Put out for the second baseman. 2-0 favor the Pirates. Last of the third inning. 2-0 Pittsburgh, and Roy Campanella up. Mel Queen pitches. High inside. Ball 1.
What you heard was the score repeated. And if you listened to a whole game, you'd hear that a lot. Because as a broadcaster, you had to remember that radio listeners were constantly tuning in at different times. So Barber kept a 3-minute hourglass on his desk. And when all the sand ran down, he'd interrupt whatever he was talking about and repeat the score, and then turn the hourglass over. According to Warren Corbett, dozens, if not hundreds of later announcers adopted this hourglass technique. For away games, Barber, like most team announcers, did recreations. But remember from last episode, Barber didn't like the whole idea of pretending it was a real game. In fact, he went hardcore in the opposite direction. From Barber, quote, "I wanted the audience to know at all times that I was doing a recreation," end quote. Unlike other recreators, Barber used 0 sound effects and set his microphone right in front of the telegraph key so listeners could hear the updates coming in. I disagree here with Barber, and I wonder what he thought about a magic show, because most people listening to recreations knew they were recreations. Just like when we're watching a movie, we know it's fake, we know it's scripted, but we choose to let go and forget and sink into our imagination. And I recently did an extra innings episode comparing recreations to Santa Claus. I wonder if Red Barber had a bad experience with Santa Claus. Maybe he had some trauma around learning the truth, and then swore he'd never deceive others in the same way. 13 years after Barber's start, another microphone moment would test him, not as a broadcaster, but as a man. Barber was already an institution in 1946 when he learned that Dodgers GM Branch Rickey was going to sign Jackie Robinson, the first black player, and Barber almost decided to quit. Here's Red Barber talking years later about that moment.
Of course, it was a shock to me when Mr. Rickey told me in confidence that he was going to bring a black player. And I had to examine myself. Of course, Mr. Rickey gave me time to either make up my mind to broadcast properly through a very stormy period or quit. And my first reaction was, when I came home, told Lala, that I said, I'm going to quit. I don't think I can go through with this. And she said, well, very wise woman. She said, you don't have to quit right now. Let's have a martini. And I began to think about it as the days went by. And I had to understand that it was by chance that I was born white. I could have been born black. I could have been born to any parents, any place, any time. And as I wrestled with myself, I heard the voice from the grave saying, report. And that's all there was to it. That's all I did about Robinson. I merely reported him, and he did the rest.
In his biography, Barber added, quote, I was not a racist. The Negroes who came and went through our lives were always treated with the utmost respect and with a great deal of warmth and a great deal of affection. At the same time, there was a line drawn, and that was that. End quote. What Barber eventually concluded, according to him, was, quote, all I had to do when he came was treat him as a fellow man, treat him as a ball player, broadcast the ball, end quote. Basically, Barber chose to step out of one world and into another, and baseball helped him do that. Commissioner Landis told broadcasters to, quote, just report. And as Barber just reported, he reported objectively that Jackie Robinson was just like every other ball player. Barber faced the problem and realized he was the problem. And he stepped into the 20th century. But one thing he never quite accepted was television. Barber broadcasted the very first televised game in 1939 and worked in television for many years, but he didn't like it. Barber's complaint about television was the complaint of many broadcasters. He said in his biography, titled Rhubarb in the Catbird Seat, quote, on TV, it's the director's show, and the broadcaster is an instrument of his, like a camera. On radio, it's my show, where my knowledge and experience and taste and judgment decide what goes and what doesn't. On radio, you're an artist. On TV, you're a servant. End quote. And today, 86 years later, people still listen to ball games on the radio, and broadcasters still make the same argument Barber made all the way back then about control and creative freedom. And in the end, some of them choose radio and less money over television because radio is simpler. And radio, like a book or article, allows more imagination on the user's part. But unlike a book, radio offers more of a one-on-one connection between the voice of the broadcaster and the ears of the listener. But it's more than this. In the beginning, radio was a new way to find companionship without asking for much in return. Just listen. Listen to the broadcaster. Listen to a few ads, and we'll do the rest. And radio was both predictable and surprising. You might know some of the programming, but some might be a surprise. And today, that's what you still get with radio. So many feeds, so many apps you can plan and program. But the radio, you leave it on, it keeps going. Sometimes it's disappointing, but sometimes it delivers a nice surprise. And for baseball, what once was new is now nostalgic. You can today turn on a game and hear the same sounds, the same advertising, that you heard as a kid listening with your friends and family. In a way, today's radio is a living museum, a connection to the past that's accessible by simply flipping a switch and turning a dial. How cool is that? This isn't to say that television wouldn't have its place. And next episode, we'll see what happens to baseball when the machine that carried moving pictures across thousands of miles tiptoes around the scene for several years before it finally settles in for good. Before we end tonight, another listener baseball story. And all of the listener baseball stories are unique, but I think that word really applies to this story. And I think you'll agree after you hear it. Tonight's story comes from Victoria in Australia.
My baseball journey starts way before me. My great-grandfather was a pitcher in the Blackstone Valley League, and then he went on to coach in Baltimore. And then my grandfather, as a result, grew up just die-hard baseball fan. And for some reason, lost to time, a die-hard Red Sox fan. So then he passed that on to my dad and his two older brothers. But sadly, my grandfather died when my dad was really young. He was only 3 years old. So growing up, baseball was kind of the only real connection he had to his father, and finding kind of a second family in Red Sox Nation, I guess. So he became even more of an enthusiast. He's just a complete fanatic, and radio to him was huge because he grew up in Ohio, so he didn't get any of the broadcasts for the Red Sox games, but every night he would sneak out of bed after his bedtime and call up his local radio station, and for whatever kid logic reason, he'd put on a fake voice, like a fake disguise, and calling it the Red Sox score before he went to sleep. And he would just do it every night, and the radio station people clearly knew it was the same kid calling, but they would just play along and give him the score. He became a pitcher in high school and got a scholarship to play in college, but then he was hit by a car right before he was supposed to start. So he couldn't play baseball anymore. And he figured out, with the help of his brothers, that one way to make it to the majors was to become a groundskeeper. So he became a professional groundskeeper, which was cool. And fast forward, by the time I came along, he was working for the Brewers in Milwaukee. That's where I was born. Old County Stadium was like a second backyard for my sister and I. Like, we would run through the sprinklers when it wasn't a game day, and my parents would set up like these elaborate Easter egg hunts all through the stadium, and we'd eat bubblegum from the dugout, and it was very charmed in many, many ways. But then on the flip side of that, my dad was working on the field when he was targeted in a random attack and was intentionally run down by a driver in a rental truck. So he was hit by a car for the second time. And his injuries, mentally and physically, were devastating. So he responded to that really by just throwing himself even more into his work. So he was working 80, 100 plus hours every single week. So then the way of, like, how was Dad's day today? It was listening to the broadcast. And so Mom always had the radio going in the car. Every summer, it just was this constant background noise, and kind of a way to feel connected to my dad when we didn't see him all that much. So it was just this constant hum, and that warmth and nostalgia and feeling of like crickets through screen doors and like the heat of the day cooling off. Up until I was 7, we were in Milwaukee, and then my dad got the call, if you will, and he got an offer from the Red Sox. So we moved to Boston when I was 7, and he was the groundskeeper there until last season. He retired, stepped away for medical reasons. It was just this incredible place to grow up. Like, you step into Fenway and you feel the power of that energy and that history and that something so much greater than you every time I'm at the stadium anyways. And also the response my dad felt to live up to this dream that was not only his dream, but his dad's dream, his brother's dream, his grandfather's dream, and his connection to them. So his work ethic and intensity just became more and more intense. So yeah, listening to the broadcast was a way of knowing him half the year, essentially. In 2013, like, that was a very significant year for Boston because there was the marathon bombings, and then the city really came around the Sox. And it felt like that playoff run and that World Series win was so much for this city and for taking it back from like this tragedy and making it our strength. I mean, that was the whole motto of that team, was Boston Strong. And so following along that playoff season, being so far from home, but still feeling a part of it, was really poignant for me. And when it was coming up to the World Series, like, being a Red Sox fan, I'm very superstitious. And I had a camping trip booked, and I was like, if I cancel this camping trip, we won't make it. So I have to leave it in place. But there was a real question mark because it was off this like remote island off the coast of Brisbane. And there was a real question mark if I would get a radio broadcast. And so it was a gamble going. But I got there, and the first thing after driving all this way, off-roading, all this stuff, I was like, I've got to check if I get my radio signal. So I put it on, and it's a little bit scratchy. It comes and goes, but I can hear the game. And so I listened to that World Series win in a tent in the wee hours of the morning off this little island off the coast of Australia, surrounded by wallabies and crashing waves. And it was just me and a couple of friends, and they all were supportive, but not really understanding of my hoots and hollers. And that was a bizarre but special win for me, for sure. Listening to the broadcast now, it brings such a peace and a calm, and it's like a pair of old jeans almost, it's just soft and comfortable, and it feels right. And I'll be one of the people. I love the television broadcast too. I think Fenway is so photogenic, and when the lights hit the grass and the contrast with the red clay, she shines. But I'll be the person that puts on the radio broadcast to watch over the television footage. I just find it like home.
Thanks so much, Victoria, for this incredible story. And if you want to hear the entire interview, you can find it on Patreon /MidnightLibraryofBaseball.com. Chronologically, I should be talking about the evolution of baseball from radio to television in the next episode. And I will talk about these things in episode 7. But I'm throwing a curveball because I've been so excited to put out this next episode. And I'm the boss, so I'm going to. This whole season is about radio and television broadcasts, and that includes iconic television shows. So, next episode, from The Simpsons Season 3, Homer at the Bat. The show is produced and edited by me, Ben Orlando. Music by Sergi Papkin and Ashot Danielian at Pixabay. Good night.